and to interact informally. On your question, allow me to take a step back, because one can only offer very superficial explanations to what happened to Germany and to German foreign policy due to the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. When the Federal Republic of Germany was founded at the end of the 1940s, it was established under our Grundgesetz, under our constitution, as a country that was per definition, an anti-status quo country. Because it was written in our Grundgesetz that the final objective, the overriding priority, was to overcome the division of Germany. Wiedervereinigung. So we were a country devoted to overcoming the status quo. That was the principle of our action until 1990, when it was achieved. Our adversary during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, in contrast, was a country exclusively devoted to maintaining the status quo. The Soviet Union had no other objective than to maintain the territorial acquis, which had been negotiated or arranged at the end of World War II, dominating Eastern Europe, either by acquisition of territories or via the Warsaw Pact. All of Eastern Europe, think of the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, think of Poland, Romania, etc. So that, for the entire period of the Cold War, was the situation. Germany, anti-status quo; Soviet Union, status quo oriented. In 1990, with unification having been achieved miraculously, this began to change overnight for Germany, not so overnight for Russia. Germany, within a millisecond of the ratification of the 2+4 treaty and the implementation of unification, became a status quo country. We had achieved what we wanted. And from then on, mainstream Germany started not an indiscreet, but an open love affair with the status quo. We fell in love with the status quo. And I will say, and don't misinterpret this as a, unacceptable criticism of Angela Merkel. If Angela Merkel managed to get herself re-elected several times, it was maybe not only, but it was also because she was able to suggest to the German people that if you elect me or re-elect me, not much will change. The status quo will continue. Things will be good. Trust me, Sie kennen mich. That was the message, and it worked. It worked until last year, including last year. The Soviet Union disappeared and re-emerged as the Russian Federation. And we thought, on the basis of what we had experienced in the Cold War, that we now satisfied with the status quo, that we could now implement the kind of partnership idea which had inspired us even during the Cold War. Das Gasröhrengeschäft, that goes back to the 1970s, when Mannesmann, manufactured the pipes and the Soviet Union provided the oil. And we believed that forever, by a law of nature, would Russia be interested in providing, without ever using this as a weapon, these fossil fuel resources, gas, oil, etc., to us. The German political elites refused to even start having a discussion about what degree of dependence should be tolerated, should not be tolerated, etc. You can go back through the transcripts of Bundestag debates, regardless of whether an SPD chancellor was in power or whether Angela Merkel was the chancellor. No one, not one voice from the opposition, serious voice from the opposition, said, hold it, this is going in the wrong direction. It was an almost uniform belief that we were doing the right thing. Love affair with the status quo turned into love affair with the idea of partnership with Russia. And it's like in a personal relationship. If your partner starts cheating, sometimes people hate the idea of admitting to themselves that that's happening, because they don't want to end the partnership. And the Germans were unable to understand even in 27, when President Putin gave his fundamentally anti-Western speech at the Munich Security Conference, or in 2008, a year later, when he took away from Georgia a couple of provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, or in 2014, when the Crimea was annexed and the unrest in Donbass was manipulated by Russian secret services, etc. We believed, and again, this is not meant as a criticism of Angela Merkel or of Frank-Walter Steinmeier, etc. We believed, even beyond 2014, that you can successfully negotiate the problems that had been created by this more aggressive Russian behavior. So that's why Angela Merkel tirelessly engaged in the Minsk discussions, negotiating the Minsk agreement. It never occurred to us that maybe Putin was not going to be interested in having a Minsk agreement that was going to be implemented. We have had a very hard time throwing this idea of the love affair with the status quo and the idea of partnership with Russia overboard, including, of course, in the energy area. I'm sorry for speaking for so long, but I think this is, this is almost, this is not just a political decisions. This was psychological. This was deeply ingrained. And there was this additional element, which you also find in so many speeches by German leaders, Dankbarkeit gegenüber Russland, because they helped us obtain unification. So, there was a special relationship of gratitude and saying thank you and Versöhnung and reconciliation. And the fact that Ukraine existed all along was quite often overlooked by German elites, not by the German foreign ministry. When I was a Staatssekretär in the foreign ministry, I remember we wrote a memo to for the chancellor, for the government, for the foreign minister, saying that an independent and stable and secure Ukraine needed to be regarded as the Schlussstein. The Schlussstein is if you build an out of stones, if you build an ark, you have in the middle the Schlussstein. And when that is set in, the ark is stable. So we thought Ukraine, once established as a solid country, would be the Schlussstein in the security architecture of Europe. But the developments over the last 10, 15, almost 20 years led Germany to focusing almost exclusively on the partnership idea with Russia. And Ukraine was didn't get as much attention as it should have had. So my answer to your question is, no country has suffered a greater revolution in its foreign policy with regard to our eastern neighbors than Germany. For us, today, not all, but almost all fundamentally held beliefs of the last decades have gone up in smoke, up the chimney. Weapons deliveries into areas of conflict, partnership with Russia gone, needing to accept that we have made a huge mistake by trying to conduct a national energy policy as opposed to a Europe-based energy policy. So this is tough for Germany. And I understand even that some of our partners and neighbors are now saying, didn't we tell you all along? Have you not paid attention to the fact that the European Parliament has voted 3 times against Nord Stream 2, and you simply ignored it? So it's your own fault. So we're getting hit by criticism from our Polish, French, and other friends in Europe, not even to mention the criticism from the Republicans and others in this country. This is a huge difficulty. Finally, just to conclude, I am aware, of course, as everybody in Berlin is aware, that Olaf Scholz has been seen as dragging his feet, as doing what he needed to do at the very last moment and with the least, commitment and engagement. Immer der Letzte. Well, why was that happening? Remember, in a parliamentary democracy, which Germany is, you need the support of your own Fraktion. And if you have, and I'll be very blunt here, if you have a leader of your Fraktion who is in essence a person who does not believe in the idea of deterrence of nuclear weapons, who is in essence a pacifist, and I don't blame him for that. He has, Rolf Mützenich holds strong beliefs which have been, of course, held by many in the leadership of the SPD, and not only in the SPD. So changing the course of this old ship, the SPD, on such fundamental issues as war and peace, and weapons, and delivery of weapons, has been an overwhelmingly difficult task for Olaf Scholz. Not so much vis-a-vis his other coalition partners, the FDP and the Greens, but vis-a-vis his own party. I'll stop here.
Wolfgang, thank you for this really wide-ranging and rich response. I have a number of different threads that I'd sort of like to pick up on, and I'd maybe like to start exactly where you ended, talking a little bit about the SPD and the Social Democrats, because I wonder whether this shift, whether this transition could have happened with the Social Democrats and the Greens in the opposition. Do you think it makes a difference that they were in government now and that Olaf Scholz sort of took this lead and is trying to lead his party in this direction?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think that if you were asking why the Angela Merkel government didn't see the light of day on these issues, I think if Angela Merkel had decided a year ago or so to change course on Ukraine, on Russia, the entire German left would have gone out, and demonstrated against. Kriegstreiber would have been the signal. So there are situations, and this is not the first time that it happens in German politics. There are situations where only an SPD-led government can change social legislation. That's what Gerhard Schröder did 20 years ago. Remember the so-called Hartz reforms? There are other cases in other countries where the same thing happened. I think of abandoning apartheid in South Africa, etc. And here again, only the SPD, only Olaf Scholz could have uh, steered this ship in this direction of abandoning these firmly held beliefs that have been held for decades in Germany. Absolutely. In this sense, this has been an amazing opportunity.
So I think everybody would agree that this is a tremendous opportunity, and I think a lot of people saw what an opportunity is presented when they heard the Zeitenwende speech that Olaf Scholz gave on the 27th of February. But it's also a real challenge. I mean, he made some big promises in terms of defense spending, as you said, in terms of delivering weapons to a conflict zone, but also in terms of energy dependence. And so one of the things that I think a lot of people are struggling with is whether these goals, as they've been laid out, at least initially, can actually be implemented. One of our viewers actually asked, why is Germany still buying Russian gas? The energy piece is something that we can talk about separately, but if you look at the security side of things, the energy side of things, the fundamental change in the Weltanschauung and foreign policy look, there's a lot to do. Can it be achieved?
I will admit personally, but of course I have no responsibility in the government, and I'm also not the CEO of an energy company. So it's easy for me to join the chorus of people, and I joined the chorus of people who said we should try to move in the direction of a gas and oil boycott of imports of Russian oil and gas. The initial mainstream view in Berlin has been, it's not possible. We are so dependent, and we are dependent. But sure enough, you know, this German ship changes course not so quickly, but it does change course. As I'm sure many of you know, Germany is now not the country that stands in the way of a stop of oil imports from Russia. We have a couple of other countries in the EU that have an even more serious problem with that proposition. So I think sooner or later the oil boycott will happen, and it will not be stopped by Germany. Point one. Point two, with respect to gas, our dependence is particularly acute. But Robert Habeck, the Green Minister in charge of the economy, but also of energy, has just announced, I forget whether it was the day before yesterday or yesterday, that he believes, and that's a major step which you should not underestimate, that he believes that if we all save a little bit of gas produced energy, we could probably get over a boycott, a gas boycott winter. In other words, he is now creating the vision that maybe not, you know, not in June and not in July and not in August, but over the coming months, we can move in the direction of then also not standing in the way of an EU organized gas boycott. The idea being that if we save in households, by companies, etc., 10%, and if all our neighbors, you know, chip in, the Dutch, the Norwegians, LNG, which we don't have, as you know, we don't have an LNG terminal in Germany, which is a shame as far as I'm concerned, but that's the situation. But of course, there are ways to import LNG via Dutch terminals or other terminals. So I think we are trying, the German government is trying very hard to make it possible to also not stand in the way of a gas boycott. And we would only make that possible, of course, if we are satisfied, or I shouldn't say we, if the government is satisfied that this will indeed not create a severe recession. It would probably lead to some degree of recession anyway, because of the unavoidable rise of energy prices, which is underway, which has already happened. So I think we're actually surprisingly today on a positive track, and I think the German government, having had to accept a lot of very severe criticism for dragging their feet over the last couple of months. Finally, now we're coming around, and I don't think the government deserves this serious criticism now anymore. They're making a huge effort.
Thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about and that you've touched on is how fundamentally German policy toward Russia has changed since the end of February. One of the questions that some of our viewers and some of the people in this room have heard me ask other speakers as well is, to what degree are business leaders and government leaders in Germany also rethinking policies towards China right now? Because the sort of interrelationship or interconnection between Germany and Russia has been along the lines of energy, a little bit of trade, and let's not forget that, but it's basically been about energy. The ties between Germany and China, the economic ties between Germany and China, are so much more complicated and complex than the ties to Russia, and yet there's a similar kind of interdependence, if you will. Is that debate unfolding? Are people talking about the relationship with China in light of the sea change in Germany's Russlandpolitik?
Yes, I think the debate has begun. We need to be aware that the entanglement, if that's the right word, of the German business community with China is, of course, hugely different from our entanglement with Russia if you leave the energy sector out. So China is a much bigger problem, much bigger challenge for German business. Think of the automobile industry than Russia. For most German companies, cutting their presence or their businesses in Russia is painful, but it's not life-threatening for the companies, so far as I have seen this picture. But let me add a point. I believe, but this is really my very personal view, I believe that we need to make a distinction between doing what is necessary to put pressure on Russia so that this war can be ended and that Russia doesn't continue or start yet another aggressive expedition elsewhere. That's a clearly established goal. But I think our goal should not be to permanently end the vision of some degree of cooperative life with Russia. The problem is Russia will not go away. It will continue to be the largest country in the world. It will continue to be available sooner or later again as the provider, not only, maybe not less of fossil fuels, which we will need less and less and less going forward, but of all sorts of other raw materials. I don't think it is in our interest to think to entertain a vision of Europe and European security where Russia is sort of in prison, sitting in a jail cell, trying to get out. I don't think that's a vision that deserves the designation of stability. So I think we need to think beyond this crisis. And if we think beyond this crisis in the medium and longer term, um, it is important that we exercise a degree of verbal discipline. It makes a difference whether we define our current objective as helping Ukraine to defend their borders, their existence, against the Russian invasion. That's one way of putting it, to which I would subscribe. It is a very different definition of our objective if you say we are in favor of Ukraine's victory over Russia. What the hell does that mean? In my book, this is irresponsible, blah, blah, blah. And I would warn against these types of undisciplined statements. There were some statements coming out of certain mouths of senior US government representatives, and I was interested in noting that when I was in Washington the last 3 days, discipline had now been reestablished. Everybody I met, whether it was Bill Burns of CIA or senior White House officials, used the exact same language. We want Russia to fail in this invasion. But no one said, we want a victory over Russia, which is a different goal. I also believe that it is important that we stick to the mission. It is not, I think, in the collective interest of Europe and the United States if the rest of the world looks at this conflict and how it's being handled as a conflict between Russia and the United States. I think it's in our interest to make sure that the entire world understands that this is our effort to defend fundamental principles of international law, to help a country defend itself against an illegal aggression by a nuclear power. So let's not transform this into a US-Russian conflict. I mean, as a practicing diplomat, if I know one thing, I know the following. As soon as food shortages, which are already on the horizon in the Middle East, in Africa, because Ukraine cannot get their grain. Ukraine is a hugely important grain exporter. And this will lead to dramatic food shortages unless some miracle happens. And I can tell you right now that Russian diplomats will run all over Africa saying, you can't feed your people. You know whose fault is that? It's America's fault. It's NATO's fault. The Russians would have never invaded Ukraine if NATO hadn't moved too close in this direction. It's a very easy narrative to present to to countries who don't really understand the details of what happened. So we need to understand that this conflict has immense potential repercussions far beyond America, Russia. That takes us to the China question. And it includes our relationship with the rest of the world. This is a major, major conflict. Finally, on your China point, we were together earlier this morning at a small gathering at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I will repeat what I said there. The Biden administration takes pride in the fact, and I support that, they take pride in the fact that they managed, by seriously intervening in Beijing, to prevent Chinese arms deliveries to Russia. Thank you very much. Great. I believe that that is good. but I believe that is not the necessary level of ambition which should drive us. I think our ambition should be greater. I think we should entertain the ambition to do the best we can, to do everything we can to make the Chinese climb down from the fence on which they've been now sitting, and explain to them that we expect of them to use at least a little bit of their leverage, which they have vis-a-vis Russia, to tell the Russians to end this war rather earlier than later. I think I know for a fact that for the Chinese leadership, when Putin told them that he was going to do this, he probably told them this will be a quick so-called special military operation and it will be over before the Easter recess. A few weeks. Now we're in the third month and there's no end in sight. Everybody, the US intelligence agencies are saying, they've said it publicly. Avril Haines has made a public statement about it a few days ago. We look at a war of attrition, which can last many months. And then there is the threat of the use of nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction. That must be seen in Beijing with a huge degree of uncomfortable, certainly lack of appreciation. It produces effects which are absolutely not in the interest of China. The re-emergence of the United States as a leader in Europe, the unity of purpose of the European Union, the fact that NATO is not only not brain dead, but alive and kicking, getting probably 2 new members in the next few months. Finland has just announced, Sweden will follow. I mean, China is very much anti-NATO and blames NATO for almost everything. But as this conflict drags on and NATO becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, this cannot be in the interest of China. So I think there is an opportunity, a strategic opportunity for Europe, maybe more than for the United States, to talk to the Chinese about using at least a little bit of their leverage against Russia. And maybe we can offer them something in return. And I'm not talking about public discussions. I have been critical, again, as a practicing diplomat, I've been critical of almost everything that has happened in this war since February 24th has been done by megaphone diplomacy. You know, Joe Biden announces that he's going to talk to Putin tomorrow morning. Emmanuel Macron publishes a lengthy account of his most recent thing. I think we need quiet diplomacy, which the United States used extremely successfully when Nixon and before Kissinger flew to China to arrange the US-China relationship. Our Entspannungspolitik in Germany would not have been successful in the 1970s and early 80s without the secret trips that Egon Bahr made to Moscow. So I know a little bit about quiet diplomacy, or you can also call it back-channel diplomacy. That's what we need at this moment, not megaphone diplomacy.
I'm going to ask another question, but if people in the room have questions, catch my eye and I will fold you in. Wolfgang, of course, you talked about the global implications of this phase of the conflict, and you just touched on something I wanted to ask you about, namely Finland announcing its intent to submit its documentation to join NATO, the expectation that Sweden will be following suit at the beginning of next week. This has the potential to really sort of reshape the strategic balance in Europe that has existed for decades. And so I wanted to try to get your thoughts on how this conflict is influencing or impacting Europe's security order?
Great question. Yeah. First, let's look at the facts. The facts are that if Olaf Scholz, that was your earlier question, if Olaf Scholz implements his 100 billion, defense
Bundeswehr.
program, etc., Germany will be a different military, will be in a different dimension of military power than we've been in the last decades. The second fact that most people ignore is that if this war continues the way we believe it will continue, once it will have ended, Ukraine will be will have the single most effective, most powerful, and most fearful military organization of any country in Europe. The size of the Ukraine army far exceeds, even today as we speak, the size of the German army. We have twice the number of citizens that Ukraine has. Ukraine will end up being a very, very capable country. So how, this is a question not for today, but for the future. How are you going to organize a relationship between two hostile countries if they remain hostile to each other? The Russian Federation and Ukraine, which sharing a border of almost 1,000 kilometers, if there is not, as in the past, this nuclear power with huge military force on the one side and a weak Ukraine on the other end. That was the situation 10 years ago, 5 years ago. In the future, there will be this Ukraine believing that when push comes to shove, we can probably beat the Russians. So how are you going to maintain the peace along this border? And then comes the additional, for the Russians, the additional complication of a Finnish NATO membership and eventually Swedish NATO membership. So lots of things are about to change. And I think that the real fantastic opportunity that offers itself in this crisis is to build a meaningful European Union capacity in the area of foreign policy, security, and defense. Emmanuel Macron, when he made his far-reaching proposals, remember his famous speech at the Sorbonne 4 years ago, etc. He never got a response from Berlin for a number of reasons, I guess. I think it is now high time for the German government to respond and to come up with a meaningful concept, which would also allow us to respond to a concern which I think exists in certain quarters in Europe. If Germany, because of the 100 billion euro budgetary input into our defense effort, if Germany ends up being a much stronger military power, is this going to create concerns among some of our neighbors, upsetting the existing balance? Well, the simple recipe to counter such concerns is to do what is actually written in the current coalition treaty of this tripartite coalition, namely, and I say it in my words, namely to commit German economic, political, and military power to serve the interests of the European Union. In other words, to make our power available to a, hopefully in the future, more respected, more capable European Union. Germany in the service of a European Union which serves all 27 or in the future even more member states. I think that's the immense opportunity which offers itself. and it offers itself, on a very practical basis. We started some years ago 2 large military procurement projects, the future fighter aircraft, FCAS with France, and also with France, the project of a future tank. Both projects have for obvious reasons, not unexpectedly, run into huge issues because Rheinmetall is not happy with their share of the work, and Thales is not happy with their share of the work. So I think what needs to happen now, if you ask me, is that Macron and Scholz, when they next meet, they should issue a joint statement saying that come hell or high water, we are determined to push these 2 projects through. It will happen. And we will bang the heads of Herr Papperger, whatever his name is, and the Thales, we'll bang their heads together. We will make them agree, the necessary compromises to get these projects going. If you have more money available, which is what will happen in Germany, it will be much easier to achieve the kinds of necessary compromises. At a moment of absence of funding, you fight unnecessarily over a couple of million euros, which is ridiculous. But if you have these enormous funds available in the future, we can, if we handle it right, we can make them work. We can insert them into projects that are part of a larger European mission, including the Spanish and the Poles and the Italians, etc. So I think there is a huge opportunity for Europeanizing our defense and security efforts. So this crisis, in the longer term, presents an opportunity for the EU and for EU defense.
So we have 4 questioners and 12 minutes. Christiana, I'm going to ask you to pass your mic to your right to Dale, and I'm going to ask you, Dale, to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Dale Ponnick-Vart. I'm a former partner of Milbank Tweed, and I'm a board member here and legal counsel to the ACG. You touched on the third world, the global South's reaction to the war, focused on the grain problem with the Ukraine. Isn't there a fairly direct diplomatic route that can be taken starting now to insist that the Russians allow the grain harvests to be planted, because I understand that should be decided now, and to then guarantee that they won't attack the fields while they're growing, and then that they will allow the Ukrainian merchant marine to ship the grain per their usual arrangements around the world? Wouldn't this be a effective counterweight to the Russian, and I understand also jointly with the Chinese approach to the global South?
You can actually hand your mic to Sven.
Absolutely, yes. And I think there are all sorts of efforts underway to make things happen. For just one example, the European Commission has started to examine ways in which Ukrainian grain can be transported not via the ports through the Black Sea, but maybe through over railway connections to the west and then to the south. Whether that's a promising additional or alternative route, I'm not the expert on that. But yes, efforts are underway, and I know that Antonio Guterres and others have raised this issue with Putin himself. Yesterday, I forget whether it was yesterday or this morning, get confused with the timing. Olaf Scholz had a telephone discussion with Putin, and according to the readout, which has been made available by the Chancellery, he raised this very question, the coming food crisis, with Putin, and demanded that Russia provide opportunities for the grain to be exported and for the wheat to be planted, etc. And there's, of course, also a huge problem, as I understand it. Again, I'm not the agricultural expert, but I understand that there's a huge problem with, wie sagt man, Dünger, fertilizer. Fertilizer. BASF, for example, BASF is a hugely important producer of fertilizer for the agricultural world. And if they can't get their fertilizer not only to Ukraine but also to Russia, because Russia, of course, is also a producer of grain, we have all sorts of complications. And simply to say that these things, these questions, the secondary effects of the ongoing war are going to be, they will turn out to be long-term headaches. And as I said earlier, I repeat myself, they will offer important opportunities, nefarious opportunities to the Russians to disseminate disinformation and blame the West for hungry children somewhere in Africa. I know it for a fact.
Sven.
Yeah, Sven, I'm a European American Business Organization. Thank you very much for your remarks. That's always enlightening. First, I just want to make a brief comment to what we just talked about, your question. We also don't know where the ammunition is that is in the fields and the mines that may have been put there for whatever reason. But my question is talking about China. Who would be the European politician who could actually talk to the Chinese president? Who is the leader, so to speak, of Europe? I mean, Macron's presidency of the EU is going to end at the end of June. And is it the Commission that will be the spokesperson or one of the individual heads of state in Europe? Thank you.
Okay. Well, we recently had an EU-China summit, one of these formal summits, and that is, of course, an opportunity where Ursula von der Leyen, as the Commission President, and Charles Michel, as the President of the Council, engage with Xi Jinping and his Prime Minister. So the EU should try to play their role, but it's obviously not good enough, because the Chinese are smart enough to know that real power is in the national member states. So traditionally, I think from a Chinese point of view, they want to hear from Berlin. Our problem is that the person they trust and they've known for 15 years, 16 years is now gone, and Olaf Scholz has not had the time to visit. So there is not yet this personal direct relationship. Personally, I had some little doubts about the wisdom of the Chancellery to decide that he should go to Japan and to other Asian countries first. I think I know my Chinese friends well enough. They didn't like that. They believe that every country in the world should understand that China deserves to be recognized as numero uno. So it's important. That would be my answer to your question. It's important that Macron, uses his relationship, but the German relationship is 10 times more important. I mean, for obvious reasons, our business entanglement is, of course, also important from a Chinese point of view. It's not only important for us. So Germany plays a key role in this. And I hope that there will be an early opportunity for this to be used in, behind the scenes in personal discussions, because that's the only way we can talk to the Chinese leader, not via megaphone.
So I'm going to suggest that we take 2 closing questions and then give you a chance for final remarks.
Right.
So Dagmar, you're next, and then Val. So Christiane, if you can pass that 2 down. Dagmar.
Ambassador Dagmar Kassan, formerly Bavarian Industry Association. As a follow-up question to Steve.
You might have to talk into the mic.
Into the mic. Okay. Is this better? Yeah. To follow up on your question, Putin strongly already is against that Finland is joining NATO, and he is threatened already repercussions. My question is, do you have any thoughts what he could come up with so we are prepared?
Okay.
Thank
next.
you.
And then Val.
Thank you. Ambassador, I must thank you because one of my greatest worries has been that often in the thickness of the darkness of the night, we forget about the next day's sun, and that the sunlight is what makes humanity endure. Similarly, in the instance of the thickness of darkness of war and aggression, we forget that it is the peace of the day after that makes humanity endure. So I appreciate very much in the 3-4 different ways that you have been alluding to, how can we, in addition to the rush of arms that we are seeing, rush to fortify the infrastructure of the peace of the day after. I am interested in your thoughts on a critical part of that will be addressing the deficit of trust between the governed and the institution of governance. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that as a contributing factor in our societies to building that framework or that infrastructure for enduring peace. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. On Finland, I would not expect a serious Russian attempt to disrupt things. I think the Russian military has demonstrated that their capacity to address even the relatively limited challenge in Ukraine was not impressive. So I think the Russian military, the last thing they want to do is open a second front and start. But they will, of course, make life miserable they will try to make life miserable for the Finns and conceivably for the Swedes in all sorts of ways, in economic ways, in trading wood and all sorts of goods. They will try to punish these 2 countries. It will be our job to make sure that that punishment will be balanced by appropriate measures inside. Both countries are members of the European Union. That's the one difference between Norway, which is not a member of the European Union, and these 2, who will be both, of course, now both members of NATO and remain members of the EU. So if I have sleepless nights at this moment, I don't have them over the Finland, Sweden. I hope I'm not wrong. Finally, on your question, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. What I certainly agree with is, and we have not discussed this much, is that the element of trust is one of the very essentials of any international diplomatic effort. And what we have now produced, or what has been produced as a consequence of Russian behavior over the last almost 10 years or so, is the almost total absence of trust. Remember last summer, when Angela Merkel was still in power, She and Macron proposed in the context of the EU an initiative to start a strategic dialogue between the EU and Russia. This was before the invasion. And the majority of other member states rejected this idea on the grounds that the argument was, what sense would it make to start a dialogue with a government that lies all the time? How could we ever trust anything that they will say to us? I happen to disagree with this argument because I'm looking at my American friends. And they have, I mean, it's currently interrupted, I guess, but they have started or restarted with Putin so-called strategic stability talks. They have the arms control discussions of the continuation of the New START agreement and various other existing or potential avenues of dialogue. And it is not good, if you ask me, that 450 million Europeans have no meaningful channel of communication with Russia. If you don't want to trust Russia, you need to be able to verify. That's a classic principle of arms control. I used to be in our arms control work for a number of years. Don't trust, but verify. The United States can verify every single Russian ICBM. They know exactly where the locations are, and they can find out whether the agreed limitations are being honored or violated. This is why such agreements can be negotiated and agreed and even ratified by the US Senate, even in the absence of personal trust. So I think wherever it is possible to verify, we should not abandon the idea that we should we need to work with Russia. We need to work with Russia on the JCPOA, I mean the Iran agreement. We need to work with Russia on climate. And at the end of the day, President Zelensky will want to sign some kind of peace arrangement. He doesn't need to sign that with Germany. He needs to sign it with Russia. And the only one with whom he can sign that under current circumstances would be President Putin. Our job will be to make sure that whatever agreement may be reachable between these two can then be verified and maintained, and that international guarantees be provided that make sure that Ukraine isn't going to be dropped in a black hole by some kind of Russian tricks. But I think the principle should be that wherever we can verify, we should not declare ourselves totally unwilling and unable to engage with Russia. Russia will continue to exist. And finally, I need to run, but let me just say this. For a German of my generation, I will never forget what President Richard von Weizsäcker, who was our president at the time of unification, what he said on the 3rd of October, 1990, the day of unification, gave a long speech at the Brandenburg Gate. And part of that speech contained a paragraph, which I quote from memory now, where he said, now that the wall dividing Berlin has fallen, now that the border cutting Germany into two has disappeared, and the dividing line which has divided Europe is gone, it must be our mission, I think that's more or less what he said, must be our mission to make sure that this dividing line, this wall, is not going to be resurrected 1,000 kilometers to the east. It was an almost prophetic, when you think of it today, an almost prophetic vision. And while we cannot make that happen in the way he envisaged it in 1990, we should not lose sight of that. I think it remains a fundamental objective from a German point of view to engage with Russia in a way that would create a peaceful, comprehensive arrangement. But I do accept, of course, that it takes two to tango, and Mr. Putin has decided a decade ago that he isn't going to do the tango with us. And we, unfortunately, as I tried to say in the beginning, we ignored for too long that he wasn't about to tango with us. So at the moment, this remains a vision which is not implementable, but a vision that's not implementable may become implementable in 5 years or in 10 years. And we should not lose sight of that. Thanks again.
Wolfgang, you started with history and you ended with history and the historical perspective. And I very much would have liked to close by asking you how historians, in light of the current conflict, might reflect on Ostpolitik, Handel durch Wandel, and the 2+4 process. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to have that exchange on another occasion. But I just want to thank you so much for this incredibly thoughtful and incredibly thought-provoking exchange. It has been wonderful. Consul General David Gil, thank you for being with us today. Christiane, huge thanks to you and your team here at Deutsche Bank for hosting us. To all of you in the room, thank you. And to our viewers, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
But big thanks to you.